Hey everyone, and welcome to the Babylon Chronicles, a podcast dedicated to taking a look at the workings, discussions, and shenanigans associated with making one of the world's most powerful, beautiful, simple, and open web rendering platforms, Babylon.js. My name is Jason Carter, also known as Pirate JC in the Babylon world, and I'm joined by my co-host, Delta Kosh, also
Yes.
known as David Katui. And we are so incredibly excited today to welcome CJ Looi to the podcast, who is the co-founder, the brains behind a product called Pixcap, which we'll learn all about. But CJ, do you want to give a quick intro to kind of who you are and maybe like how you got into the world of Web 3D?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Jason and David, for this opportunity. So,
Pleasure.
maybe I'll just go straight into it. So
Yeah.
Pixcap is essentially a design tool that is supposed to make 3D easy. And what we mean by easy is like, we make the interface of 3D through a 2D based interface that people are used to, such as, people are used to using Canva, people are used to using Photoshop,
Yeah.
Illustrator. So those things are generally speaking a lot more accessible to the vast majority of designers in the world and even marketers as well. And so we are trying to basically provide that sort of like abstract away the complexities of 3D through a 2D interface, but everything is powered by 3D. Everything in our app is powered by Babylon.js, right? Um, so yeah, the use cases which we can get to in a second, basically range from using icons for UI UX designs, like using 3D icons, also using mockups, 3D mockups for graphic design purposes and branding presentations and things like that. And then we're going to be releasing something that's very exciting, which is going to be around the animated icons side of things, which can be used for like, UI UX onboarding and so a lot of these things are powered by Babylon.js, and so that's why we're very grateful to be using the engine.
That's awesome. I love it, CJ.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Love to hear.
excited to dive more into some of the product use cases of this because I think the graphic design space, and you hit the nail on the head, is largely 2D traditionally, and there's a lot of complexity involved in the transition mentally from designing in 2D to designing in 3D. Before we get there, though, just real quick, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your personal story. Where'd you grow up? How'd you get into this space? What attracted you to 3D design? What's the personal side of CJ?
Yeah, sure. So growing up, I always loved playing video games, especially 3D video
Good.
games.
You're a good person.
Yeah. Welcome to the
Yeah, I
club.
mean,
Yeah.
I don't quite play video games as much anymore, but when I was younger, I did play quite a lot. And in fact, my co-founder and I, we knew each other since I was 12, and we
Mm.
bonded over video games. And at the time, we were playing a lot of Call of Duty, and I remember, like exam time was coming, and we kind of like didn't really bother with studying, and we just kept playing video games between the two of us. We still got pretty good grades at the end of the day, so
There you
The
go.
power of gaming.
no regrets, no regrets.
The power of gaming.
Yeah, right. And so the one thing that I always thought was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool to sort of like create video games in the future? Okay, now one thing led to another, and obviously what we have witnessed is you have a lot of amazing game engines like Unity, Unreal Engine, but it still seems that the content creation side of things remains relatively challenging. And so what we have witnessed is that a lot of the content creation happens to be very focused on games in particular. So you have like things like Sketchfab, you have Quixel and all these other platforms that are catered towards games and very hyper realistic assets. MetaHuman, for instance, is very focused on hyper realistic avatars. But there's nothing quite so much that's really focused on the graphic design asset side of things, right? So and if you think about it, actually a lot of the design world, they're very much stuck on 2D land. So either they use existing 2D stock assets and vectors and they edit those things in Photoshop, or if they do want to use 3D content, then they either have to learn Blender, which is very difficult, or they have to resort or settle with stock photos from the internet like Shutterstock, and like using all these different things. And so the downside to that is that you cannot really customize any of those images that easily. I mean, sure, you could try to use Photoshop to customize those pixels, but it's not as simple as it looks.
No, it's complicated, of course.
And so our mission at Pixcap is to try to make this a lot more accessible and focus a lot more on the graphic design and the UI UX design side of things, which is to make 3D a lot more accessible there, so that their designs, they don't have to necessarily settle with just 2D based vectors, and they can actually consider 3D icons, 3D mockups, 3D graphic design assets as a nice alternative to what they're currently used to, which is just purely mostly 2D based vectors or SVGs, right? So that's kind of like the long sort of like story. But in terms of what I did before Pixcap, I was actually working in robotics. So I was at this company called Dorabot. So I was working primarily on robotic vision and computer vision. So I was working on deep learning models and training the robot to see, so to speak. And so there was a combination of the AI side, but also the 3D geometry and basically computer vision side of things.
Yeah.
And so one of the things was that I was also given an offer to join a self-driving car company, but then I sort of turned them down because I wanted to do something different. Again, you have a lot of super smart people in the world already working on robotics, working on self-driving, and I thought to myself, all these guys are so smart, and like, what is my net contribution to this field? It's probably very minimal. So I always kind of remembered back to my high school days of playing video games and not studying. Um, I did study a bit, but and I realized that content creation side of things is still very much a problem that remains to be solved effectively, especially in the design space. I mean, games is kind of like getting there to some extent, but you still need to be very technical. You still need to know Blender. You still need to know a lot of these tools, right? And so I felt that a lot of these tools are not easy enough, and I think something needs to change. So actually, Pixcap didn't start off as the design tool that we are. We initially started off focused on game development, right? Again, because that was the dominant market at the time, and I think at the time we didn't really think so much about the wider design space as a whole. And so the the easier sort of like low hanging fruit, at least we thought was the low hanging fruit, but turns out it's an extremely saturated market. Is we looked at game and trying to make game animations, specifically character animations, easier for game developers, right? So one of the bottlenecks that we saw was that game developers, they often would outsource some of the assets or content, maybe use Mixamo, something like that, and then import that into Unreal Engine or Unity. And so we felt that there wasn't an easy way for them to customize. And in fact, today there's still not a very easy way to customize character animations as well. It's still very, very complex process. But at the same time, we felt that we weren't exactly solving a pain point necessarily, because it turns out that a lot of these game developers, they would outsource, and they would happily outsource this content creation side of things to 3D artists, 3D animators. And so that this turned out that this wasn't a problem, and not moreover, again, it was saturated, right? You have Mixamo, and Mixamo seems to be good enough for a lot of like basic use cases for a lot of basic games, at least like at the prototype phase. And then if they needed something a lot more complicated, then they would hire or outsource it to somebody else, or maybe just hire internal 3D animators and modelers. So we weren't exactly solving a pain point, and we felt that again the market wasn't exactly that big, and so we actually pivoted quite quickly literally right after we got funding. So we got funded by Sequoia, and they're now renamed to Pick15. So basically Sequoia Southeast Asia and India. So we're part of the Sequoia Search program now. It's called the Pick15 Search program. And like right after we got funding, like we said, hey, maybe this isn't working as well as we thought it would be, and we need to kind of like figure this out, right? And I remember my co-founder and I, we were sitting down in a cafe in Singapore in the Starbucks, and he just immediately said, dude, this thing is not working out, man. And it's like, he was like so adamant. And I was like, wait, hold on a minute. Like, let's really think about this, okay? We got funded for the previous idea. And now you want to change and pivot completely away from that. So that's maybe take a step back and think about this. But then I think that was, the more we thought about it, the more we realized, okay, first of all, the game development space is very saturated.
Very saturated.
Very saturated. There are also a lot of amazing tools that animators and modelers are using that can do all these amazing things. There's an entire education system and industry behind that content creation side of things, just for like professional work. But then if you look at the wider design space, right? First of all, there are a lot more designers than 3D game artists and developers. And also in the wider design space, there seems to be a lack of customization when it comes to 3D assets. And so that kind of like started the seed of the idea, okay, which is that maybe we should pivot towards building a tool that is a lot easier, that can cater to these designers and solve a problem for these designers, which is fundamentally it's being able to customize a lot of different assets in a way that's easy. And 3D assets, right? And so one thing led to another, and we kind of like quickly saw that, okay, you kind of like two main categories that are kind of doing this to some extent, but not super well, right? So the first category is you have, again, Shutterstock or like Icon Scout or a lot of these like stock asset websites. They provide the stock asset imagery of 3D content, and then the designers can download them and use them. And then on the other side, you have like a lot of these up and coming 3D SaaS platforms. A lot of them are web based. And you know, a lot of these tools, they're still very much like, some of them are, they are actually quite promising. It's just, again, they're not exactly solving the ease of use problem. And what's stopping a lot of designers from adopting 3D is because of like for them 3D is just not as intuitive, not nearly as intuitive as like the 2D thing that they're used to, which is sort of like this square thing, and then you can resize and scale just like in Canva, just like in Photoshop. So it turns out that using the 3D gizmos for them is something that's quite, I wouldn't say challenging, but it's counterintuitive for, you know, compared to what they're used to, right? They're so used to working on a flat screen, and makes sense. And so for us, the idea was to say, hey, you know, if we want to solve a problem for this group of users, we need to differentiate from everybody else and actually give them something that's easy. And so what does easy mean? So easy means that the interface has to be familiar, because if the interface is familiar, you've used it before, then therefore it should be easy because it's so familiar to you, right? So we said, hey, you know, what's familiar to designers all over the world? Well, it's this 2D interface. It's like, you know, you can resize and scale, which I can demo to you guys later. And it turns out that, you know, this is the by far the biggest unique selling point for us. And we talked to a lot of our users. You know, we are, I would say, we're growing pretty decently. So we just hit our highest like growth month. Yeah. So
congratulations.
So, you know, thank you. Yeah. Obviously, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more things that we need to do. But I think, you know, the one thing that really resonated with a lot of our users was simply the fact that we were just a lot easier when it comes to 3D, and that we
and maybe you mentioned that. Do you think you can just, for the podcast, showcase for 2-3 minutes like a basic use case so people can
visualize it?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So let me do a screen share right now.
Perfect.
Screen share my window. Okay, so you guys can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
So our product actually, if you could just split it, our product fundamentally solves two different use cases. So one is on mockups, and one is on icons and characters. So we categorize characters and icons illustrations all under this icon category. So it's effectively mockups and icons, right? And so mockups and icons, they both represent the sort of like basically digital assets that are based in 3D. So I can show you some of the mockup stuff, but I think the icons are maybe a bit easier to kind of like understand. So icons are effectively like, obviously we're gonna like make it a lot more organized, right? So, you know, we're kind of just starting out in the sense. But the idea is that they can just pick any icon that they see, and then they can click on it, and then they can customize it in a way that's 2D. So again, the first thing that you notice is that everything is a 2D interface. So you can see it's very similar to, well, a lot of users say it's very similar to Canva, which I think is a compliment. And you can also like move sub things within this and also rotate it. So you can see that where this is different from Canva is the fact that you can rotate it. You can change the lighting, you can change the shadows. You can also change like, oh, this is a minor bug here. So thumbnail, but yeah, you can also like change the colors. So yeah, you can kind of like change the colors and everything, and then like use this to fit your brand colors, which again is quite important for a lot of, you know, design agencies or brand agencies, or like, you know, if you need this in your marketing material to fit your brand assets, or, you know, for your app, for instance, right? Like your app, you have a UI UX icon that says you want to purchase something, so you need to be able to customize every single thing to fit your brand and to fit your vision, or to fit the designer's vision of what they want. And right now, it just so happens that 3D stuff is very complicated to edit, and so they're stuck with stock imagery on, you know, Shutterstock or like some stock as a website like FreePic. But when it comes to actually using 3D and customizing it, it's still a big challenge. So over here, you can change the lighting. Again, this is something that's not possible in Canva, obviously. So you know, this is like really leveraging the power of 3D and making it as simple as possible, again, through a 2D based interface. We also have some AI capabilities that we're going to, I can show you guys really soon. But yeah, this is effectively what it is. So it's quite simple, and then you can also drag and drop like assets, like let's say you want a Bitcoin.
Yeah, but I was about to ask, and then you can take something from the left, and yeah, cool.
Yeah. So like yeah, so you can basically like, and then yeah, you can put it, and then you can like again, you can like resize it and scale it just like you would in Canva, right? And so then that's kind of like one of the nice things here. And you can also bring to front, send to back. So that's on the
yeah.
front.
That's the classic 2D language, yes.
Yes, classic 2D language. So like, no need for 3D. Obviously, we do have the 3D mode here, which is something that's optional. But I would say the primary dominant way that every designer,
of course, yeah, you want to keep it easy to use. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think if I may interject, I really want to emphasize something that you're saying, which is I think a little bit of magic of what you found here is it's so hard for people who maybe aren't familiar with this 3D space to recognize just how complicated it is to learn how to edit and work in a 3D environment from a 2D environment.
And that's funny because, sorry, Jason, but when you switch to 3D, when you click the 3D button, I felt it immediately, like, oh my gosh, oh yeah, there is the perspective and everything. Where is what before who? Like, it's super complicated. I feel like I'm in Blender right now.
Yep.
And so you nailed it. Like, with this mode, it's complicated. With that mode, with 2D mode, oh, okay, yes, make sure.
Yeah, I think there's this magic that exists in the idea of you have countless graphic designers out there in the world who are familiar with traditional 2D tools, right? The illustrators, the Photoshops, the Canvas of the world. And there are certain established design parameters of how people and user paradigms of how people interact with their content, right? And how they edit their content. And what you've done is you've taken a completely foreign language, which is the design pattern of 3D, which is honestly not one dimension of more complexity. It's 100x more complex. And you've taken it and you've said, how can we introduce something that feels familiar with the paradigms that these people are traditionally used to? And I think there's magic in that. Like watching you navigate this, and I was playing with it myself a bit yesterday, and I was like, wow, this is just so easy. In comparison, it's just such a simple tool to be able to use. So I really think you've hit some magic here.
I agree.
Thank you. That means a lot. So there are actually also a lot of very interesting things that we're doing. So for example, one of the things is characters. So like I mentioned, we actually started off with characters, and we've actually kept a lot of the character stuff, like such as, for instance, the ability to change the pose, right? So there isn't any platform that's easy to kind of like really be able to quickly change poses for any character in the world. I mean, and so we want to make sure that this is a very easy process for people where they can upload a character or pick an existing character from the library, and then kind of like repose it using the sort of like library that we have, and manipulate again everything in a 2D way, so that again, just like how it feels in Canva. So it's just pretty straightforward. And then also change like things like the materials, right? So for example, you have this character and you want to change his t-shirt or material, so you can change it to something that looks a bit different.
That's funny because behind the scene, all it's 3D, and I guess you are manipulating an orthographic camera to give it that 2D look, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes, super smart.
Yeah,
very, very smart. I also really like that you have a section of models called cool teenagers.
Yeah, we can drag and drop one of those, and we're gonna revamp this. I think we haven't. So we're gonna like revamp the whole thing basically, to make it a lot more to make it a lot more sensible for graphic designers and UI UX designers, right? So you kind of like mix and match and then kind of like edit and move things around just like in Canva. Again, if you import like something in Blender, for instance, you have to like figure out where it is in bold space. And
oh my gosh, it's your 3D mode, right? Like everything is in 3D, your brain is in 2D, so you have to project yourself. It's of course.
Yeah, exactly. So then even 3D mode, you have to like look at this and then and then kind of like, okay, and then at the end of the day, you mainly want to just focus on one particular view.
The final image. My goal is my final image. So I completely buy that for sure.
I love it. CJ, maybe we could turn briefly, real quick, over to talking a little bit about some of the technical challenges. So obviously, as you guys pivoted, as you're talking about your story and you pivoted from into this kind of designer world, I'd be interested in hearing like what technical challenges arose in this process. If you're used to dealing with kind of a 3D world, but thinking in 2D paradigms, what does that mean for designers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think so what does it mean for designers? I think the idea is to kind of like abstract away the 3D as much as possible,
Yeah,
and then
I see that.
I think so. So there are pros and cons, for instance, right, to introducing 3D. So for instance, right, if I drag let's say this Bitcoin into the scene, they would expect the thumbnail to reflect exactly how it looks, just like every other platform. However, in 3D world, because there's lighting and there's all these different things, it's a bit different. So you're not going to get exactly the same as the thumbnail unless the lighting is set up in exactly the same way. But if let's say you have a pre-existing scene like this one, then the lighting again it's going to be quite different, right? Compared to what they're seeing here. So this is again one of the nuances of 3D versus 2D is the fact that you can give the exact hex code of a color, but you may not be able to get the exact output that you want in terms of the coloring, simply because of the difference in lighting and shadows. And so that's kind of like a different element. So I would say, but at the same time, you can twist it and say, well, this is actually a benefit and perk of 3D. So you can actually have a lot more possibilities. So you may not see the same identical thing as what you see on the thumbnails because of the lighting and shadow differences, but you can play around with a lot more possibilities, such as, again, lighting, shadows, materials, which are not available to you in 2D tools. So I would say this is
you have
feature,
both
not a
power.
bug.
I see.
A feature, not a bug. Yeah.
And you guys didn't start off with Babylon, right? You were using some more traditional game development tools.
Well, actually, we started with Babylon very early, but the very first, so before Babylon, there was a very brief period where we used Unity instead. So, I mean, we were considering 3JS and Babylon, but before that, it was, Unity. And so I think I can show you a screenshot of like what it looks like before. It was like very primitive and kind of silly looking back. But I think that the idea was that, again, because I was fairly familiar with Unity and one of my co-founders also pretty familiar with it. And so we felt that, let's do something that we're familiar with and be able to create like something. So what is something that's that we can embed 3D into and that works well for characters, right? And so we, I mean, Unity seemed like like the first choice for us, but then we quickly realized that the build times were extremely slow, and also it wasn't optimized for the web. And again, Unity does a lot of things. Unity does a lot of things amazingly well. It's just at least for native web stuff, it's kind of maybe that's not its competitive edge, right? Let's put it that way. And so so we decided, hey, this build time is a bit too long and it's a bit clunky, and we need it to be very small, especially the build file size has to be extremely optimized for the web, right, to serve it fast. And so we said, hey, let's look into web native WebGL frameworks. And so we looked at 3JS and Babylon, and then after a lot of different like we looked around the different forums and everything, and then we decided to stick to Babylon. And the reason we decided to choose Babylon over 3JS at the time is because we felt that obviously you guys are backed by Microsoft, and also the fact that the community was super active.
And it's always a big one. Yes.
So I think the community is like by far like the thing that I'm.
We managed to not disperse ourselves. We have this feeling that only one place is enough. Like we have everything in the forum, right? So we don't have a different source of truth, and that helps a lot. So we gather everyone at the same place, and it's doing wonders.
Agreed.
It's amazing. It's by far one of my favorite things about Babylon.js is the community. Like I remember, I still do sometimes, right? I'll get my team to post, or raise a few questions, or maybe post a couple of like suggestions, and the team is always super responsive. So it's
love that.
Amazing. It's an amazing community.
Well, thanks. We definitely agree. It's an active group of people from all over the world, and I think the common goal of trying to make 3D more capable, more beautiful on the web is something that kind of everybody really shares.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit, go a little bit nerdier on some of the unique challenges involved. So you have this interface, this product that is very simple, very, very simple. And then behind the scenes, you have an engine which is fairly capable. And so part of your job, I would imagine, is to try and obfuscate, to hide some of the complexity of Babylon from the user. So what is, tell us a little bit about that process of like behind the scenes, the code that is making this possible and really making it, hiding that from the user in a way that makes it not intimidating and makes it easy to use.
Yeah. So I think I can give you a couple of examples. So the first example would be, again, people are used to working in 2D space. So let's say even like basic operations like resizing or rotating in screen space, right? So all those things that you would think is like straightforward, like duh for a designer, you still need to program each and every one of those like individually, again, because it's a 3D engine, it's not a 2D engine.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things you kind of need to like work your way backwards and say, hey, how can we make this such that it feels and exactly just like Canva. And so again, because we're not using a 2D engine, we're using a 3D engine. So we have to do everything with like camera space, world space, and all those things, and then, do all those things in between. Another thing would be like, so sort of like, let's say, again, another super common operation is sending forward, sending backward, like, again, stuff that everybody does and takes for granted. But in 3D space, you kind of have to compute like, the bounds and the bounding box and like, and then like kind of move it and then shift it and then like adjust it and shift it, like kind of like this thing in like a layering system, right? So you kind of like have to map all those things and then like project it in the camera space so that you can calculate which one is behind, which is in front.
It's funny. As you were showing off your demos, I was literally going like, how do they do the front to back? And I was like, I bet you it's using a bounding box to find out. And then I was going like,
bounding box is one of the ways, But
then I was thinking, I was like, that's actually what posed the question, was that exact example, is like that the process, the problem solving of you needing to hide the idea of the bounding box of an object, where its vertices are located, so that you can just simply bring something to front. The complexity involved in that, to hide that from a user, is actually quite significant. That's not an easy mental jump to be able to do. A lot of times in design tools in the 3D space, you give people the exact control to do the specific thing they want. That's not what you're trying to do. You're actually trying to say the exact thing that you want to do, I want to hide that from you completely because it's way too complicated.
Hide the Z-axis completely.
Yeah, exactly. Hide the Z-axis, and instead, how can I make something that just feels very simple and intuitive? So it's funny. That's the exact scenario that popped into my brain there. I love it. The other one that kind of pops into my head, which is, I think, a little bit of a unique challenge in the designing from a 3D space, is the concept of lighting. And you showed this off a little bit. Lighting and shadows in the 2D space is often something that people create by hand. And the environment, the idea of lighting an environment as a whole, is kind of a new concept in the 2D space. So what's your approach to navigating the complexity of lighting and shadows and the softness of shadows and hardness of light in an environment where people are used to drawing their own shadows?
Yes, very good question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the easiest way is maybe not to explain it so much and just show them really, really good content. So actually, initially, in the early stages of this after our pivot, we struggled a lot with getting the right content, right? Obviously, right now it has improved a lot, but we're actually gonna release like a huge update that's gonna like be a lot better than what you saw. Because again, at the end of the day, content is king, right? The output is everything.
That's always the same problem.
Yeah, so like it has to look super good, and the thing with design is that they don't have the patience to learn Blender. Like it's not like something that's like some really awesome motion design in Cinema 4D or Maya. Like okay, you can do it from scratch. I mean, these guys, they don't know how to do it from scratch. So you got to provide them with the sandbox and the content pre-made beforehand and well crafted just for them, and that fits their visual aesthetic.
So they can just tweak it and make
they can just tweak it, right? Exactly. And so that means that also informs like the lighting presets and the shadow presets, which we're actually going to do a revamp of, is that everything needs to be very easy and it needs to look good by default. So and again, also to answer to your point, which is lighting and shadows, another thing that a lot of people don't really get or appreciate is the difference between like the client rendering and ray tracing, right? Like so that's actually something that we have incorporated. So we actually work very hard to build this layer to have a ray tracing component that runs on a server on the back end. So this is actually a big part of our product. A lot of our users that do use that actually love using the ray tracing. In fact, a lot of the content thumbnails that we generate are using ray trace thumbnails
Yeah,
and not
they are
so right? Again, because there are limitations to running on the client, right, with the rasterization and everything.
Of course,
But this is not something again that a lot of designers know from the start, and so I think there's a bit of education involved in that sense, and I think we're still trying to slowly bridge the gap. But I would say at the end of the day, it has to look good. The thumbnail has to look really good. So when they click on it, the client render has to also look pretty good, and then obviously the ray trace render will look even better. But basically everything has to look good right out of the box.
Yeah, for sure. I respect that a lot. I think that's definitely a really good way to look at it. The other thing that pops into my head a little bit is thinking about, you mentioned earlier that you have mock-ups, I believe is the word you used, and icons.
Yeah.
Why stop at mock-ups? Why not think about the tool and the idea of 2D interface to 3D content being a final design tool? Is there a thought process there as to why you draw the line where you draw?
Yeah, you raised a really good question. So actually, in fact,
it's good at question.
Yeah, so in fact that was the original idea. So I think I would say this is actually one of the mistakes we made. So it's a learning lesson. So we actually originally started with icons, right? And we actually got a lot of very good feedback from icons, but it was literally the exact same thought process, which is, can we make this into an end-to-end design tool? And I think by thinking about it that way, we kind of got carried away, by trying to make an end-to-end design tool. So first of all, making an end-to-end design tool sounds good in theory, but in practice, designers are not going to use it because they have far superior tools for compositing.
Yeah, they want to integrate into.
They can do it in Photoshop, Canva, Illustrator, right? So what purpose does your tool serve, especially when you have to deal with an additional 3D element, and it's clunkier than Canva? I mean, let's face it, or Photoshop. It doesn't have nearly as many features for like pixel manipulation. So why would they want to use your tool to do those kind of like advanced things? And so we actually learned this the hard way. Like we kind of tracked our metrics closely, and we shipped this. We literally put this as the first thing, right? Now you can see it's the last thing. We're even considering taking this out. But yeah, we basically put this as the first thing on our homepage. And what we found was that the activation for a user declined right after we shipped it, and it declined and it stayed that way for several months. And so it was exactly that thought process where it's like, hey, can we do something better? But at the same time, I think we got carried away, but we also didn't understand the user journey well enough.
Yeah.
And we sort of said, hey, maybe let's try to do this thing because everybody seems to be doing it. Canva seems to be doing it. I think Kiddo is another company that does this. But again, that extra additional dimension of 3D, again, somehow it can't be as easy as Canva. It will never be, right? And so you have to solve it for a different use case. Okay, and then so we had to say, okay, let's take a step back and what are users primarily using this for? And then mostly it's still icons. And we added mockups relatively recently, but again, it's still more on the icon side, so you can customize a lot of the icons and things like that. So yeah, I would say that's a very good question. We had the exact same thought process. We went through it, learned the lesson the hard way, and kind of like had to revert and take a step back and now say, hey, it's mostly about the digital assets, the content that they cannot get anywhere else. And so why try to build a worse version of Canva that, let's face it, Canva can do those things a lot easier and better, and they have so many more templates. But focus on something that you can do that Canva can't do, which is around the customization of the 3D and the mockups, and make a niche out of that and differentiate from that.
I think you're being too hard on yourself when you say that you learned the hard way. I think you learned through the scientific method. You tried an experiment. And exactly, it worked. Right. It revealed some results, and you pivoted to where there was a need in the marketplace. And so, yeah, it's fascinating. It's interesting to think about that, right? To think about, hey, because 3D is prohibitively complicated, it's not a part of the design process. There's not a spot for it. And so if you can make it easier to use and more traditional for people, where would it fit? And I actually think it's quite interesting to say, like, I hear you that icons is definitely a place where it has a unique foothold. The idea of mock-ups also is fascinating to me personally, because in that construct, it's like, well, if you want to come up with an idea or just get the initial layout to be correct, maybe there's an opportunity for 3D in those early stages. And I think that's quite fascinating. Let me ask you one other thing, CJ. I'd love to hear, as we've talked about, this is all powered by Babylon and the web. I would love to hear what is your favorite thing about Babylon? I think you mentioned the community earlier. Maybe from a technical perspective, one of the things that you found stands out to you. And then also in the same breath, what's something that Babylon needs or could do to be better?
Notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the one thing that I really like about Babylon is backward compatibility. I think you guys also made a lot of efforts into making sure that a lot of things are backward compatible.
I love every time we have an interview and the person say that, because it's such a fight internally to keep that.
I know.
It's hard.
I know.
It's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like that means that every time we do an update, we don't have to worry about our code breaking and things like
Yes,
that. We
exactly
can just
that.
focus on the main things.
Look at that.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that I really like. And again, the other thing is also the community. Like, I praise about, basically it's the idea that, if you have an issue or a bug that you want to raise to the team, somebody's going to be on it, and more likely than not push like a PR very soon. And I think that's something that you don't necessarily see in a lot of other open source community projects. So yeah, I think in that sense, this is like really, really amazing. And so which is why I sometimes, when I do have time, I try to contribute a little bit. I don't contribute as much anymore, but I think my rank is like Jedi or something in Babylon.js.
Yeah, it's not that bad. Jedi is good.
It's not bad. It's not bad. But it's still a long way to be a Jedi master. But hopefully I'll get there someday. Okay, so you're also asking me like what are some of the things that Babylon.js can improve. So I think there are a couple of things. So the first thing is, I think this is not just me, but actually a lot of other engineers raised is the fact that I think the rendering, there's this perception that the rendering capabilities of Babylon.js compared to 3JS is somewhat lagging behind. So you see all these like amazing rendering projects in the 3JS, and there's no shortage of those, right? And they seem to be a lot easier to find, and it seems to be a lot easier to integrate into the rendering pipeline compared to Babylon.js, where perhaps it's a lack of documentation on that front, or lack of examples, or a combination of the above. That gives it a perception. Now, whether it's true or not, I think the main thing is there is this perception that persists.
Yeah.
I think for perhaps like even wider adoption of Babylon.js, it would be good to have a lot more of these things, especially, rendering is so important, right? If the output isn't amazing, then people wouldn't necessarily want to use it, especially designers, or and more brands and companies, they want to see that their output looks good on the web, right? On whether it's interactive or not. And so I would say rendering examples and documentation is one thing. The other one would be, I would say, I think one reason why 3JS seems to be very easy for a lot of folks is because of I think React Fiber and things like that, right? It has a very close ecosystem for fitting with React and things like that. And I think Babylon.js could also have something like that possibly. Again, because so many developers use React, and
we do have one. We do have one.
Yeah, but I guess it needs to be more popular and more known. Right?
Yeah, it has the same problem, right? It's not well known. Yes, so it's a perception.
Yeah, it's hidden. Yeah, those are great. I really, I think one thing that is phenomenal that I love about the 3JS community in particular is there's just countless examples, endless sea of examples that you can look at and see the code. And there is definitely, a set of examples that have Babylon, but I don't think it's nearly to the breadth of what 3JS has. And it's something we talk about a lot, is all these amazing projects being done. How do we surface them? How do we get people to be able to showcase bits of code and how to use Babylon in unique and interesting ways? It's great feedback. Absolutely love it. I think it's,
and we have totally agree. We are maybe that's very early, but we are thinking about having a viewer. We already have a viewer model as well that get not very much used. And you mentioned React Fiber, and on the same vein, I would love also to be able to provide a very simple viewer, like the model viewer that is available for 3JS. We are also thinking about that, like being able to share that lightweight way of just you drop a control on your page, right? And then it could be a React control or a web component, and then in render the scene, you don't have to think about it. It's also another aspect we would like to fix in the same vein.
Yeah, there's also one more thing, I guess, which is that I get this a lot from developers, which they say 3JS has all these nice rendering stuff, and it's well integrated with React Fiber and things like that. So then the question is like, okay, what does Babylon.js do a lot better than 3JS? And that I get the question a lot. So just wondering, like, maybe how would you guys sort of address that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I'll maybe go first, and I'll say I think both platforms are incredible and serve slightly different purposes. We're huge fans of 3JS. I think 3JS is a little closer to the metal, a little closer to WebGL, gives you a little bit more control. And while it is easy to use, I think Babylon, we've really tried to not too dissimilar from your mission, has tried to obfuscate some of the complexity a little bit, try to hide some of the complexity. So for a long time, we had this idea of one line of code equals one feature. And so could you add something like a ray casting capability of picking a mesh in a single line of code? And so, of course, you can have access to all the complexity under the hood to get to that. But if you wanted to just do something very, very simple, there is a method in the API that allows you to do that. And so I think that layer of one line of code to one feature, I think that's something that is a unique thing that Babylon offers that maybe makes it a little bit more approachable to someone that's entering this space from a development standpoint for the first time. David?
Actually, when I created Babylon.js, I had three things in mind, three different that still remains today. The first one is a friendly community, centered, one central community. The second one is backward compatibility. Like we are doing that far better than 3JS. And I have no problem to say that to Ricardo because it's definitely a different mindset and comes with strength and weakness, right? I don't say, but I am attached to backward compatibility. And the third one was mentioned by Jason is ease of use. And somehow I recognize that with Pixcap, right? Like you say, hey, how can I make that easier? Right? And that in my case was, okay, we have 3D, WebGL, it's complicated. How can we make sure that a user who wants a shadow just have to say, cast shadow equal true, right? That's it, right?
Yeah.
And that the three main differences I'm seeing.
Yeah. So I think we're about out of time here, but before we sign off, I do want to do two things. The first and foremost is to encourage everybody to go check out pixcap.com. Make sure you go check it out, use it, play with it. It's an incredibly intuitive tool, and just see what's being done to make the complicated become easy in the design space in 3D.
Exactly right.
And then the last thing is just to say, CJ, on behalf of the entire community, thank you. Thank you for being a part of this podcast. Thank you for contributing back to Babylon. Thank you for taking some of your ideas and feeding it back to make the entire ecosystem a better place. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I want to say thank you for Babylon.js and the entire community. I think community is like one of the best things, my favorite things. And I'll try to continue to contribute in any way that I can, again, because I think, like, I've been involved in some open source projects, and I think the Babylon.js is by far one of the best ones.
Lovely.
Love it. Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us, CJ, and we'll see everybody on the next podcast. Have a great day.
Bye,
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone.